This is the second lesson of Chapter 8. We're going to be looking at a more in-depth view of photosynthesis. Let's start with the overall reaction for photosynthesis. This is the balanced chemical reaction, showing the reactants on the left, which are carbon dioxide, water, and light energy, and the products on the right, which are glucose and oxygen. Now, like we've learned in cell respiration, this reaction also happens in several sub-stages. It doesn't all happen at once. So as we go through the reaction, I want you to be able to identify which stages as well as where in a cell do these products and reactants come into play. So let's start with a visual overview of photosynthesis. And from this, you can see that photosynthesis is a two-stage process. The first stage is the light reactions. The second stage is the Calvin cycle. Now, this illustration is shown on a chloroplast. So as we're working through these slides together, bear in mind that this is a model for a eukaryotic cell that has a chloroplast. That does not mean, though, that prokaryotes don't use photosynthesis. They just don't have chloroplasts. They would have photosynthetic membranes within their bodies where this would happen. So we're going to start with the light reactions, and that will probably be the topic of this lesson. We'll save the Calvin cycle for the next one. So if we zoom into the light reactions, we see that the reactants of water and light are being used here. And by the way, water would be a chemical reactant. Light isn't a chemical, it's a form of energy, specifically a type of kinetic energy. And photosynthesis is an endergonic reaction, so it needs that light to energize and to have this reaction proceed, converting that light energy to chemical energy. The light reactions of photosynthesis take place in a eukaryotic cell within the chloroplast, specifically on the thylakoid membranes. Remember, we talked about the thylakoid last time. Each little individual disc there, like a green little pancake, is a thylakoid, but the whole stack is a granum. The purpose of the light reactions is to convert that light energy into a form of chemical energy. ATP and NADPH are the forms of chemical energy that result from the light reactions. But in addition, oxygen is also released, but oxygen is not a form of energy. It's really just a byproduct of the light reactions of photosynthesis. Okay, so that's the broadest overview of the light reactions that we could possibly do to show you where the reactants and the products that we saw in the overall reaction come into play with the light reactions. The others we'll see in the Calvin cycle, but before we do the Calvin cycle, let's go into more depth with the light reactions. So we're going to actually zoom into the thylakoid. Like we saw with the mitochondria, the thylakoid membrane is a lipid bilayer, and within that bilayer are other molecules, including proteins. There's an electron transport chain, like we saw with cell respiration in the mitochondria. There's another protein called ATP synthase that's going to make some ATP. So it's not a completely different story for photosynthesis. There's actually going to be some of the same players with the same jobs, but there's also going to be some new characters here. And let's meet those new characters now. Something that should look new here are these protein complexes, the dark purple ones with the green dots inside. These are called photosystems. A photosystem is a protein complex that has pigment molecules embedded in it. This is where the light energy is harnessed, and the first step of conversion into a form of chemical energy is as those pigment molecules get activated by light, the electrons within those molecules get excited and they start moving around and leaving the compound that they're bound to at first before they get activated by light. Ultimately, there's a special chlorophyll molecule shown in the middle here where electrons are released from and arrive at something that's more electronegative than where they were. That's how electrons always move, and it's just a generic thing named here. It's not, we don't need to know the name of a specific compound. You're going to call that the primary electron acceptor, is where those electrons are going. Now, they're not going to end there. There's going to be another, like a linear flow of electrons that we're going to follow, but we'll come back to that when we get into the actual steps of photosynthesis. So right now we're just learning about what is this photosystem. Now you might recall from our previous slide that there were two different kinds of photosystems, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. So let's take a look at how they differ, although they have those characteristics that we just went over in common. Okay, so here we can see a comparison of photosystems 2 on the left and photosystem 1 on the right. They both have pigment molecules that get activated under light and electrons get excited. Ultimately, the special pair of chlorophyll molecules that have electrons that when they get excited, they go to a primary electron acceptor. Again, you don't need to know the specific names of those primary electron acceptors, here, although here they are listed. I'm not going to be testing you on that. However, what I do want you to understand is that the main difference here between photosystems 2 and 1 with regard to how they harness light is that photosystem 2 has a special pair of chlorophyll A molecules that have a peak absorbance of 680 nanometers. Now that's a wavelength of light in the visible light spectrum. And that's slightly different from the peak absorbance of photosystem 1 with 700 nanometers as its peak absorbance. So this is one factor that differentiates the two photosystems. Another relates to where electrons come from as they leave those special chlorophyll A pigment molecules. They need to be replaced with electrons from another source. In photosystem 2, the donor of the electrons is water. That's actually where water is important in photosynthesis. It's an electron donor. You might remember from cell respiration that water was the final compound containing electrons. So remembering that helps here because it contains electrons. And here it donates those electrons to those that are lost from the P680 special pair of chlorophyll A molecules. Unlike photosystem 2 that gets its electrons replaced from water, photosystem 1 is going to get its electrons from an electron transport chain, which we'll see when we start the linear flow of electrons. Now these two photosystems work together, even though they have apparently separate structures and some mechanisms that are independent of one another. In order for the electrons to continue flowing and ultimately produce those energy molecules, ATP and NADPH, we need to have both of these photosystems operating together. So this is how we're going to be depicting that process of the light reactions of photosynthesis. This is the linear flow of electrons from photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. And you can see the energy molecules that result from this first step of photosynthesis, the ATP and the NADPH, as well as where the water comes in and light and oxygen is released. So this is a really nice summary of the entire major events of the light reactions of photosynthesis. So let's go through these step by step. Each of the little blue dots indicates a step. So we'll just go through these together and make sure that you can put these in the correct order. So in the linear flow of electrons, the first step would be that photosystem 2 absorbs light, which excites the p680 electrons. The electron that's excited is captured by the primary electron acceptor. Now, remember that p680's electrons need to be replaced. In order for this flow of electrons to continue, there has to be a constant supply of electrons. So that source here is the water. There's an enzyme that strips the electrons from water, supplies them to the p680 chlorophyll A molecules, and when water gives up its electrons, oxygen is released as a byproduct of that. Now let's see where those electrons go. They're going to travel down the first of 2 electron transport chains. Now, remember from cell respiration that there was also an electron transport chain, and through chemiosmosis, ATP was produced. Similar thing happens here. We have the electron transport chain, which is causing electrons to flow from something that's less to more electronegative. Protons are being pumped across the membrane, building up a high concentration on one side, in the thylakoid space specifically, which then fuels the ATP synthase protein to phosphorylate ADP, creating ATP. Now this process is called photophosphorylation because it does depend on light, photons of light, to activate this process to generate the flow of the protons to build up that gradient. Remember from cell respiration that the mechanism for ATP production in the electron transport chain was oxidative phosphorylation. So although they're similar in some ways, there are some differences as well. Now back to our linear flow of electrons, because they are continuing to flow down that first electron transport chain, ultimately ending up at P700. Now this is the other special chlorophyll A pigment molecule, but it's in photosystem 1. And instead of getting its replaced electrons from water, it's getting its replaced electrons from photosystem 2. Then that excited electron will arrive at its primary electron acceptor. And then down a second electron transport chain. Ultimately, this electron transport chain ends with the final electron acceptor in the light-dependent reactions, which is NADP. Kind of sounds like NAD from cell respiration, but it is a slightly different compound, NADP. And when NADP gets those electrons becoming reduced, it forms NADPH. So think of NADPH like we had NAD and NADH and FADH2 from cell respiration. It's just a different brand of electron carrier. So you had like Uber and Lyft, and now we have, I don't know, just regular taxi. And its job is still to shuttle electrons. Where they're going to end up will be in the Calvin cycle, and we'll get to that next in the next lesson. So this is the light reactions of photosynthesis. So next lesson, we'll get into the Calvin cycle, and we'll see where the NADPH and the ATP end up going. Now, just quick little roadmap where we are. It's important to realize that the NADPH and the ATP are in the stroma, which is that fluid-filled space inside the chloroplast outside of the thylakoid membrane. So definitely be sure that you understand the anatomy of the chloroplast and where these things are taking place respected to where the anatomy of the chloroplast.